Okay, so now that we've created the tentacles, we're going to go ahead and just hide the tentacles. And to do that, we can uncheck both of these options, and you'll see that the spline and the circle are still visible. So I'm going to open this up and uncheck all of that. Right now, something else you can do is if you click and drag on these red X's, you can actually turn everything on at once, or if it's already on, you can click and drag to turn it all off. So there are fast ways to do that. So we have the tentacles turned off, and we're going to go ahead and create the body of the squid now. And this tool takes a little bit more time to get used to. And so I'm going to make a really simple shape, and then we could potentially add more detail on later. And so we're going to use the Loft object to create a loft over several different splines. And so to start with, what we need to do is essentially create a series of cross sections that we're going to stretch out over the length that we want, and then the loft essentially wraps the skin around those cross sections. So to give you an example, let's go ahead and let's make a couple of splines, and we're just going to do this as an example so you kind of see what's happening. So first I'm going to go to the spline pen. I'm going to create a circle. Then I'm going to go back to the spline tool. I'm going to create a rectangle. And I'm going to go back to the spline tool, and I'm going to create a a four-side, right? So I'll get a diamond in there as well. And with those three things, these are going to be our cross sections. So we're going to leave the circle cross section at 0, and we're going to move the other cross sections this direction along the z-axis. And so I'm going to select the rectangle. I'm going to go to the move tool, and I'm going to push this back a ways. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and rotate my view a touch so you can kind of see what's happening, right? So this was at 0, and I've pulled it back. Then I'm going to select my four-sided tool, or four-sided object, and I'm going to pull that further back. Now, with these three cross sections, I'm now going to go up, and under the extrude tool, I'm going to go ahead and create a loft. And once I create this loft, I'm going to make all three of these children of the loft. And one of the things with the loft is the order of your objects, the order of your children is important, right? So if I want this to start at the circle, go to the rectangle, and then go to the four-sided object, I want to make sure they're in that order, right? If I went circle, four-sided, and then the rectangle, the skin would come through here, connect to this, and then wrap around and connect back to the square. So we're going to do it right, and then I'll mess the order up so you can kind of see what happens. So I'm going to select all three of those. I'm going to click and drag and make them children. And I'm going to rotate this around. And so now you can see, right, I've got this crazy skin on here, and it looks kind of nuts right now. But I've got this crazy skin on here. You can kind of see it's twisting the points. So this point is connecting to that point and then to that final point. There's some settings I could adjust on here to make it a little bit cleaner, but I'm going to leave it kind of rough for now. I am going to change my display to garage shading lines so you get some clearer sense of what's happening here, right? So you can see here's the four-sided object, and you can see that this corner is attached to this corner, and this point here is attached to this point. So if I wanted to smooth this out some, if I selected my circle and I went and used the rotate tool, and I rotate this, you'll see that it allows me to, and if I do 45 degrees, there we go. Right, it allows me to make it so that this now looks much cleaner on this side. And I could potentially do the same thing on the back side if I select this four-side object and I was to rotate this maybe, 45 degrees as well. Right? But this is, this object is a little bit wonky no matter what. Okay, right, and so some of this, some of the shapes we see is it basically attempting to smooth over this rougher shape that we've created. Now you'll notice that I do have caps on here, right? So it basically covers up this end here and covers this end here. If I select the circle and I move the circle so that, or actually let's switch the rectangle. So if I drag the rectangle up above the foreside, you'll see that the skin goes through here and comes around this and then wraps over and goes outside of that and then skins over the end of the rectangle, right? So order is really important in order to make sure that it looks the way you intend it to look. You can very quickly make something like a lamp in here, but let's go ahead. I'm going to undo that so it's the right orientation. And then, right, I can use the mesh subdivision U and V tools to increase the number of subdivisions. So if I made this, say, 36, right, I'm going to get a much cleaner edge in this direction. And and this is set to 4, but I could set this to 8. And this is essentially, right, the subdivisions in between the number of subdivisions in between the different cross sections, right? That's what the V is. The U is the number of subdivisions around the outside of the cross section. There are some check boxes here. If I check mark organic form, sometimes that makes a difference in the appearance of the object. Not so much this time. If I check mark loop, what that does is it essentially creates a skin that wraps all the way around and essentially loops. You'll notice that I do have a cap on here still. So if I go to my caps and I uncheck start cap and uncheck end cap, then if I wanted to create something that that looped around and that had volume, that's one way I could use this tool to do that. We are going to probably want caps on our object. And if I uncheck that, if I go to linear interpolation, right, it's going to give me much harder edges, right? It's going to be a little bit more clean than the default, which puts curves in there. If I check mark flip normals, we'll talk about what that does maybe later. In this case, that's a really good idea. You'll notice that when I have this, there's this weird shading that's happening on there. That basically means part of the mesh is inside out, which doesn't mean anything right now, but when we start doing work with materials, it can make a huge difference in the way the material appears. So in this case, I'm going to check mark flip normals. And again, organic form doesn't really do anything. Loop plus organic form doesn't do too much either. The RSOPARM subdivision, we're not going to be so worried about right now because it's not applicable to what we're doing. Okay, right, so that's kind of how it works. So let's go ahead and start creating our object. And so, and I'm going to make it really large and then we can scale the whole thing down. So I'm going to leave the circle, but I'm going to get rid of the rectangle and I'm going to get rid of the foreside. Right, so I just have a single circle now. And I'm going to uncheck the loft. So the loft is turned off so I can see that spline tool. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a few copies of this. I'm just going to create 5 of these circles. And so to do that, I'm going to select my circle. I'm going to hit Command or Control C, Command or Control V, and then Control V again, and again. So I've created 1, 2, 3, 4, plus the one that's in here, right? And for whatever reason, when you copy and paste, it does it outside of the loft. It doesn't do it within the object that you're pasting in. So I have 2 that are called circle. I could make this one circle.0 or something like that. So it'll go circle, circle.0, circle.1, circle.3 and 4. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag these down into the loft. I'm going to make sure they are in order from circle, circle 0, circle 1, circle 2, circle 3. And circle's going to stay put. I'm going to select circle 3. I'm going to use the move tool, which is the letter E, or I can click here. And you'll notice these are all rotated 45 degrees because of the way it worked, but I'm going to use this one. This will be the far end of the squid. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this out pretty far, and then I want to shrink this. And so rather than do it numerically here, I'm going to use the scale tool. So I'm going to hit the letter T, and I could either hover here or I could grab one of these because it'll scale uniformly. And I'm going to shrink this thing down until it's pretty small. Right? And then I'm going to go to circle 2. And what I might want to do is rotate my view a bit more. Right? So that I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. So circle 2, I'm going to hit the letter E to use the move tool. I'm going to drag circle 2 so it's about here-ish. I'm not going to adjust its size yet. I'm going to go down to circle 1, pull this until it's about there, go down to circle 0, and pull this until it's about there. Now, at this point, I've got basically a tube that narrows at the top. And so what I want to do, though, is I want these objects to slowly shrink right, in size as they get closer to the head. Now, there's a couple other things we want to do. We don't necessarily want this just to be a perfect circle the whole time. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select circle 2, and I'm going to turn this into an ellipse. I'm going to check mark ellipse. And now what I can do is I can adjust this radius. But before I do that, I may want to select all of these circles. And I may want to reset the coordinates, the rotation coordinates for all of these objects, because otherwise when I start scaling stuff, it's going to be off at a 45-degree angle and it's going to look weird. So I've got all of these things selected. And one of the nice things with Cinema4D is if you have a bunch of objects selected and they all have similar settings, you'll notice that in this Z it says multiple V, which means multiple values. But over here they're all set to -45. So if I just set that to 0 once, they will all rotate at the same time, which is a really handy tool rather than having to manually go through each object and rotate it 45 degrees. So I've made that change, and now I'm going to select circle 2 again. I'm going to go to the Object tab, and now I've got my radius and my radius Y. So radius Y is going to be in the green direction. And what I'd like to do is set this to maybe 100. All right, so now I've got the radius and radius Y. Now, if I wanted to make this smaller, right, I should be able to click here and I can scale this down a touch more. And then I'm going to go ahead and scale that down even a bit more. I'm going to hit the letter E. I'm going to move this a little bit closer to the tip of this thing. I'm going to go to circle 1. I'm going to make that an ellipse as well. I'm going to take my radius Y. I'm going to set that to 100. And then I'm going to go with circle 2. Oops, sorry, circle 0. I'm going to make that an ellipse as well. And this time, though, I want it to remain more round. But I want it to be, so I'm going to just make it 150 for the radius Y. And then I'm going to leave this other one perfectly round for the time being. And so in order to see how this looks, I'm going to turn the loft back on. I'm going to check my loft. I am going to check mark a couple options. We don't want to loop it. Organic form doesn't seem to matter. I'm going to uncheck flip normals because you'll notice that it's a little weird there. So I'm going to uncheck that. And now I've got this kind of squished tube looking thing, which may be a squid head. Something you will note, squid tend to have these like wings that come out, right? And so one thing that I might do is I might say, oh, well, I really want there to be more extension here. And so what I'm going to do is I will select circle 1, whichever one it is, And I'm going to hover over the blue arrow. If I have the move tool selected, I'm going to hold down Control. I'm going to click and drag to bring this in a little bit further. And then I'm going to make my Y radius, that should be the same, but I'm going to make my radius, let's just go ahead and make it, I feel like 300 is going to be huge, but I'm going to start there. No, that might work. Oops. It might look really silly, but it might work. I think that's going to be too much. Let's go 250. And then let's go ahead and skin this. Oh, and so something to note, right? I copied and pasted that and suddenly everything is wrong. And that's because circle 4 got dropped as the bottom child in this thing. And really where we want circle 4 to be is between circle 3 and circle 2. Or sorry, circle 1 and circle 2. Right? So now I've got something that looks a bit more squid-like. And honestly, I'm reasonably happy with it the way it is currently. I might take circle 4 and make the Y radius just a little bit bigger, like maybe 120. So that way it bulges in the front and the sides a little bit. We could go through and, do a much better job making this look like an actual squid. And if we use the spline tool to create different things, but that's, in order to learn how to use this tool, that makes it far more complex than the way that we're doing it right now. And I really just want you to get the basics down so that you have a strong foundation to work from. Okay, so I've got this. I might want to make this bottom ring a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go to my initial circle. I'm going to make that radius 240 maybe. There we go. Yeah, so now it flares out a little bit. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to rename the loft to be Squid Body. This is, again, a great time to save your project. And now that I've got this squid body, I'm going to turn my tentacles back on. And there's going to be a couple issues. Right? One, you can't see the tentacles at all. And that is because I've only turned on this top object. Right? So I need to open up all of this stuff, and then I can click and drag on this to turn all of those on. And so the other thing you're going to see is that these tentacles are all really small, and this thing is enormous. And it needs to be rotated. So with the squid body selected, I'm going to go ahead and click on the coordinates tab. And we haven't really done this yet. But what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the scale. And so I'm going to set this, to start with, I'm going to set this to 0.5. And I'm starting in the X field, and then I'm just going to hit Tab and go down to Y. The S.Y should be 0.5. And I mean, unless we want a really tall head, the Z should also be 0.5. Right? And that's still a little too big, so I'm actually going to go 0.25, 0.25, and 0.25. Right? And now I've got a body that's more accurate in terms of scale to the object there. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and rotate it. So I'm going to use the letter R. And I'm going to hover over the red line until it turns white, click and drag, and maybe hold Shift so I get it to be exactly 90 degrees. All right, and now there's a few other things I need to do, but I could make these tentacles a little larger. I could also make this a little bit smaller. Now, one thing to note is, right, now this is in the XZ plane. I've rotated it 90 degrees, but it's still going to treat Z as height. So if I was to make this 1, right, it's going to make that really, really tall. So I'm going to go ahead, and I actually want this to be a little bit taller. I'm going to make it in the Z dimension, I'm going to scale it to 0.35. And then in the Y and X, I'm going to make it 0.15 for both of these. Right? And now that's like a long, tall squid. but it fits closer to those tentacles. And one last thing we're going to do, we've got a couple more tools to look at. One thing we're going to do, this edge is so clean right now that, you know, it looks a little funny, but again, we're making a really simple model. And, you know, if you were to look at this direction, it might not look so terrible. We need to we're going to put a couple eyes on this. And then we might extrude something else just because I need to show you the extrude tool as well. So go ahead and save this.